The war in Syria is entering its sixth year, and this brings back memories to older Syrians especially, and historians in the region, of another war in Syria, which took place 100 years ago at the conclusion of the First World War, when the victorious imperial powers divided the Middle East and Syria was dismantled. I don't think many people know that 2/5 of what used to be Syria was taken away, chopped off from Syria and made into different countries. One was, of course, what is now Israel, then Jordan. Other parts were handed over to other countries. A coastal strip was torn out of Syria, clipped away, and became Lebanon. And the brutality with which this was done by the imperial powers and their agents in the localities led to a huge movement of peoples and populations. And there are descriptions which can be read of refugees fleeing from the parts that were being taken away and heading towards what was left of Syria. And some of the descriptions of Aleppo, one of the oldest cities in the region, read as if they were written today. And it is a tragedy and an irony that as people in Western Europe are celebrating or marking the anniversary of the First World War, the effects that war had in the Middle East are today being repeated because another process is taking place, this time led by a different imperial power, the United States, which is drawing new lines, new boundaries, and playing with new forces in the region to try and topple old established regimes. At that time, the imperial powers were dominant, and they did what they want. The decolonization which came later created new forces, nationalists largely, socialists, communists, radicals, modernists, who wanted to make their countries independent and did, and succeeded in keeping them sovereign and independent for some time. That entire process now is under attack, largely because these forces themselves have disappeared or have given way to new forces which are very different in character and in politics, and largely because the United States now, as the dominant world power, is changing different parts of the world, and the Middle East, the energy center of the global economic regime, is under heavy fire and attack, with unintended consequences which have made the situation far more worse than it was 25, 30, 40 years ago today. If we look at Syria today, we see a country in ruins, we see starvation, we see people dying on the streets. We are told that almost 250,000 Syrians are dead, that many thousands of them were children, that there are 4 million refugees in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and about 7 million people have been displaced. Many towns have been destroyed. Apart from a nuclear war, could anything worse be inflicted on a country and its people? When the democratic uprising began in Syria in 2011, it was assumed that the regime might be prepared to negotiate a settlement. But the decision was taken out of Assad's hands, according to my informants, by his own party and the bureaucracy that runs the Secret Service, the military, and the regime, which has kept the regime in place since Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, ruled that country. The crucial decision was made when a huge demonstration in Deraa, a northern town in Syria, completely unarmed, without weapons, just armed with slogans demanding democracy, demanding a constituent assembly, demanding elections, was fired on. Who started the hostilities with weaponry? No doubt about it at all, it was the regime. What was its thinking? They assumed that, as in the past, repression would work. They thought that if they succeeded in frightening the people, they would go back home, not prepared to face up to deaths. Well, they were wrong. The situation had changed over the last 2 decades. There had been the Arab Spring erupting in Tunisia and Egypt and spreading to other parts of the Arab world. And the Syrian people, in their majority, felt that they too deserved rights, they too deserved some form of democracy in order to change the way they had lived and in order to change the way they had been ruled by Assad's father and Assad's son. That was the aim. In other words, they wanted a downfall of the regime and a different sort of government in their country. Had the Ba'ath leadership in Syria understood that this time the people had lost their fear and would carry on, they might have acted differently, though I don't know. Their past doesn't give us any clues in that direction. If anything, the opposite, that the only way they can deal with their people is through repression. Once the Assad regime started using guns and bullets to kill its people, the character of the demonstrations slowly began to change, and amongst the people, a new slogan went up, and this slogan was very different from how the demonstrations had started. In March 2011, banners went up which said, "We want a ruler who has direct communion with God." This was code language for saying, we want a Sunni ruler. And religious groups, at that time unarmed, began to appear in strong numbers in different forms, carrying banners, chanting slogans, which made it clear that, as in Egypt, the key force within the mass movement was going to be the long repressed Muslim Brotherhood, its militants, and to its right or left, depending on what you believe, jihadi currents who would soon come in. That this was not visible to the West is astonishing. But was it invisible? In fact, we now know that American officials at a very senior level assumed that they would carry out an operation which would defeat the regime, push through regime change. They would find a few tame businessmen to run the government, have a quick election, and try and shore up the new regime. This didn't happen. And in fact, they should have known that this was not going to happen, given what was going on in Libya, where a similar plan had failed, and failed very miserably, as this program has shown on many an occasion. The Guardian reported in October 2011, months into the conflict, that Joe Biden, the US Vice President, triggered speculation by saying that the military model used in Libya, US air power in support of rebels on the ground, backed by the French and British special forces, could be used elsewhere. This elsewhere was Syria. And from that moment onwards, there is no doubt that the Western powers started backing various groups in Syria who claimed to be, or were actually, preparing to fight the regime militarily. This decision, hardly a surprise, by the opposition in Syria to take up arms against a regime which was threatening to kill them, created a totally new situation. The original demonstrators who had started the protests were more traditional, left liberals, modernists wanting some change, were now superseded by armed currents and armed groups. Amongst them, Al-Qaeda and its wing in Syria, remnants of the old crushed Brotherhood, and later, as we know, a group that split off from Al-Qaeda and called itself the Islamic State. But the beginnings of this were visible already by the end of 2011. And at that time, huge pressure could have been put, had the West been so inclined, on the Assad regime to accept a compromise, to share power, to accept a new constitution. But the West made one big mistake on their side. They said that they would not negotiate with Assad at that time. And so the war began to escalate, with each side claiming victories. And soon it became a war in which CIA-trained rebels in Jordan and Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar provided arms, and Turkey opened its boundaries for militants of various descriptions to flood into Syria and fight the regime. This was a change in the character of what was happening, from what had been effectively a large movement of the Syrian people against their own dictatorship, now became a civil war with different powers and different factions funding the two sides. And with the intervention of the Saudis and the Turks in particular, this war acquired a religious ethnic character. What was this? That for the Saudis, this was a big attempt to defeat Iran and take back Syria for the Sunnis. This would be a big defeat, they felt, for Tehran, which was very close to the Assad regime. The Israelis were in favor of this as well, because they felt that if Syria and the Assad regime in Syria was defeated, they could then completely isolate Hezbollah in Lebanon and either destroy it or force it into submission. Hezbollah rankled with the Israelis because it was the only group in the Middle East that had inflicted two defeats on Israel. One, forcing the Israelis to quit Lebanon, the areas it had occupied, and secondly, when the Israelis decided to invade Lebanon some years later, Hezbollah was central in defeating them. So different interests of different powers began to play on what had now become a brutal civil war on both sides in that country. The legal constitutional fact, however, remained, and that was that the legal government of Syria was the Assad government, recognized as such by many parts of the world. And it was an open question as how Assad was going to maintain power, with the West and the local Sunni states lined up against him, and the Israelis bombing or threatening to bomb parts of Syria and sometimes doing so in their occupied zones on the Golan Heights and beyond. How would this end? Well, what had to happen happened. The Iranians sent in generals, Hezbollah sent in volunteers, and it became a giant conflagration in Syria with indiscriminate bombings by both sides of cities, monuments blown up, people killed, and so another wave of humanity began to flee the areas and the cities that were falling in different parts, especially in the north, and move towards Damascus. And the situation today is that even though ISIS controls large tracts of land, the majority of the population of Syria is still in areas controlled by the government. Damascus, a city till recently of 2 to 2.5 million people, is now a city of 10 million people, with all that that entails for its social infrastructure, the strain felt by all services. Life at the moment is hell for Syrians of whatever political persuasion. And the Western plan to have a quick regime change, as in Libya, failed. And one reason it failed was because the United States, the Pentagon, were not convinced that repeating a Libyan debacle in Syria would benefit anyone, and drew back to a limited extent while funneling aid and supplies to all the groups, including ISIS, whether directly or indirectly, there is no evidence, but everything suggests that aid being sent to the opposition groups was ending up somehow or the other in the hands of ISIS and the jihadis who were occupying tracts of Iraq and Syria. Then we come to the situation in 2015, when a few months ago, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, angered by the sanctions imposed on Russia by the United States and by the European Union countries, decided on a move that has, of course, now changed the situation with the Russian military specialists, with Russian anti-aircraft missiles, and a Russian naval and air force presence in Syria itself. Putin said that he had come to Syria at the invitation of the official government and that they were going to make sure that Syria was not attacked from the outside and would defend to keep Syrian skies clear and under the control of the government. This has now created a huge crisis, because the other thing that Putin decided to do and has done is target ISIS with some success. Not just ISIS, but Al-Qaeda and other groups assembled in the Jabhat coalition. This has created panic, but why? Because the official aims of Washington and its tributary states in the European Union has been that we are also trying to crush ISIS, but they've failed to do so. I mean, after a year and a half of bombing. Why? Because what they were up to didn't work. You know, bombing from the skies, lots of people being killed, drone attacks, it didn't work. And we know from newspaper reports in the Western financial press that ISIS, when people say who is arming ISIS now, the reply is ISIS is buying the weapons, and it's buying the weapons largely from the arms industry of the European Union countries, the US arms industry, no doubt, and I have very little doubt that they're buying arms from the Israelis as well on the open market. Where do they get the money from? Well, we know. They get the money from selling oil in those parts of Iraq which they do control and dominate, and some parts of Syria. That the flow of oil has not so far been stopped by anyone, and the flow of money from the oil sales is actually helping them to organize, to recruit, to buy weaponry. Now, the question has been raised that when sanctions have been imposed against Al-Qaeda, or for that matter against the Russians, by and large, it has been done quite successfully. So why have no sanctions been applied, or effective sanctions been applied, to stop the wealth from the oil which is being sold by ISIS and used to run their little towns and buy weapons? Why haven't these sanctions worked? And the only conclusion can be is that they have not been applied with due diligence. Either people are taking money and making money from it, or it's a nod and a wink from the West saying, well, let them do it. We don't know. We don't know. Benefit of the doubt should be given to those who say they are trying but failing, but it's something very difficult to understand at the present time. So what is going to happen in Syria now? Charles Glass, a respected veteran journalist of Syrian parentage who has covered that country for a long time, described in a recent essay in the New York Review of Books that on his last trip to Syria, before Putin decided to enter the conflict, he felt that the regime was under very severe pressure. Areas he thought they still controlled, control had been lost, and implied that the Russian entry into the war with the backing of Syria and at its invitation, with the backing of Iran, with the backing of Iraq, was now coming in to try and save the regime. And I think that this is pretty much indisputable, that the main purpose of Putin is to save the Assad regime, to re-enter an area from which the Russians had been driven out after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and to show that Russia, or Russian dreams of being a great power in the region, weren't over. So what is likely to happen? This is a question which nobody can reply to. Escalating the war by getting more European countries like Britain and France involved, though France already is not going to work. Who are they going to bomb and where? Are there going to be clashes with the Russians? Are the Russians going to defend Iraqi skies as well as Iranian skies? We don't know. The government in Iraq has welcomed the Russian presence. And the situation now is so confused because so many states in the region are acting to preserve their own narrow interests that no one is thinking of the region as a whole. For instance, General Sisi, in power in Egypt, supported by the Israelis and the West, is at the same time supporting Assad. Why? Because he says that the enemies that confront Assad and him are the same, which is the Islamists in some shape or form. So Sisi is supporting Assad and is sympathetic to the Russian re-entry into the region. In other words, the whole thing is a complete and utter mess. What the unintended or intended consequences of this mess will be is very difficult to predict. But one thing we can say with confidence, that the losers in this conflict are the people of Syria. Because the fact that Syria has been reduced to this state means that many people who are on neither side in this war want to get out. And that is what explains the flow of refugees to the West, to the countries which encouraged and exacerbated the war by their foolhardy and ill-thought-out interventions, and are now threatening to make it worse. The notion that the safe havens in Syria can be defended by bombs, by air attacks, is completely foolish. And on the other side, on the Assad side, the idea that you are targeting terrorists or jihadi groups when you drop these barrel bombs, which are filled with nails and metal and which can only kill civilians, is also crazy. And so when the refugees come, either to Damascus or to the West, what they are saying is, we're coming because you're the people who made this war. Now help us, give us refuge, let us in. And the language being used, as we've argued before on this show, against these refugees, describing them as swarms of refugees, in language that treats them as barely human, that degrades and debases them for the crimes that are being committed by the West itself and by some of its allies in the region, is simply not good enough. The best solution for Syria today, in fact, probably the only solution, which might last for a decade or so, would be a coalition government in Damascus which incorporates parts of the opposition, that dismantles the present secret state armies of the Assad regime, and which tries a new tack in keeping Syria into one state. This looks unlikely. The most serious opposition force in the country, but an opposition which doesn't fight the government but preserves its own integrity, have been the Kurds, the Kurdish people on the Turkish borders. And Assad was clever when he gave them effectively their own autonomy, self-determination, and virtual independence. This has made Turkey an incredibly vicious opponent of the regime. So what will come out of it all, ideally, should be a government that consists of representatives from Rojava, the Kurdish sector, the regime as it exists, but without its more poisonous elements, and those sections of the opposition, who are prepared to put the interests of the Syrian people ahead of their own narrow ways of looking at things. And a poem written 100 years ago at the conclusion of the First World War, an anonymous Syrian poet observing the wreckage that was Syria wrote the following poem. If anything, it is even more apposite today. The drums of war are beating their sad rhythm, and the living people, wrapped in their shroud, believing the war will not last a year. Dear God, may this fifth year be the end of it. The war in Syria today has entered its sixth year, and with different powers backing different sides in this wretched civil war, the sad truth is that neither side now has the power to defeat the other.